8 days before his wedding, Silas Boone realized he had made a terrible mistake. The woman he could not stop thinking about was not the rich rancher's daughter who could save his land, but the black woman behind the counter at Higgins Dry Goods. And loving her would cost him everything his father had spent a lifetime building. Silas Boone had never counted coins so slowly in his life. He stood at the counter of Higgins Dry Goods and Provisions, a 50-pound sack of flour already hoisted onto his shoulder, and made himself count out each coin one at a time into the woman's open palm, instead of simply dropping the sum and walking out the way he did with every other transaction in Miles City. "That's the full amount?" Odessa Grant said, closing her fingers around the coins without looking up from her ledger. Her voice was even unbothered, the voice of someone who had learned to keep her face still no matter who stood across the counter from her. "I know it is," Silas said. "I counted it myself." She looked up then. Her eyes were sharp, assessing the eyes of a woman who had learned early that men who lingered at a counter usually wanted something they weren't saying out loud. "Was there something else, Mr. Boone?" He hadn't meant to linger. He had ridden into town for flour coffee and a length of rope, and he had gotten all three within 10 minutes of hitching his horse. But something about the way she wrote his purchase into the store's ledger, Boone Ranch, 4 items paid in full, no credit needed, made him want to stand there a moment longer, as though her handwriting were a kind of company he hadn't realized he'd been missing. "No," he said, "nothing else." He left. He did not look back at the window, though he wanted to. By the time he reached his horse, he realized he had forgotten the rope on the counter. He told himself that was the only reason he turned around and walked back in. Odessa was already holding it out to him when he reached the door, as though she'd expected him. "You'll want this for the branding pens," she said. "Unless you enjoy losing calves to the fence line. You know cattle work." "I know rope," she said. "That's different from knowing cattle." He almost smiled. He caught himself before it reached his mouth the way he caught most things before they reached the surface of him. 10 years of running Boone Ranch alone since his father's health had failed, and longer still since his mother had stopped expecting him to laugh at anything, had trained his face into a kind of permanent composure. But something about this woman's dry, unimpressed manner cracked at the edges of it. "Thank you," he said, and took the rope and made himself walk out without turning around a second time. Mrs. Higgins, who owned the store and had watched the whole exchange from behind a shelf of canned goods, waited until the bell above the door stopped ringing before she spoke. "That man doesn't come in twice in one morning for rope, Odessa. He forgot it. Silas Boone doesn't forget things. That's half of why nobody in this town can get the better of him in a trade." Mrs. Higgins wiped her hands on her apron and gave Odessa a look that was equal parts fondness and warning. "He's engaged, you know, to the Pratt girl. Announcements coming before the frost sets in good." "I didn't ask," Odessa said, and went back to her ledger. But she had noticed the engagement wasn't in his voice when he spoke, nor in the careful way he'd counted his coins, as if buying himself a few extra seconds of her attention. She noticed it and set it aside deliberately, the way she set aside most things that might cost her more than they were worth. She had learned that lesson in Missouri, in a house where a white landowner named Emery Sutter had promised her father a fair wage for 3 seasons running and paid him nothing at the end of any of them, laughing off the debt, as though it were a joke between men who understood each other. She had learned it again when the man she loved, a soldier named August, had been dragged from a rail platform in broad daylight over a debt that was never truly his, and no promise from anyone white or otherwise had been enough to save him. She had come west with nothing but a tin box of old receipts and a determination never again to let a man's kindness go unquestioned. So when Silas Boone came back a 3rd time that week, this time for coffee, he clearly didn't need yet. She watched him with the same flat, careful eyes she gave every customer and told herself it meant nothing. "You're building quite a stockpile, Mr. Boone," she said, weighing his coffee on the scale. "Ranch runs through more than you'd think. Funny. Mrs. Higgins tells me you've bought coffee 4 times this month." Last month it was twice. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the easy deflection he'd used on every other townsperson who tried to needle him about his habits. Maybe I like this coffee better than most. It's the same coffee it's always been. Maybe that's not what I meant. The words hung there plain enough that neither of them could pretend not to have heard them. Odessa kept her hands steady on the scale, though her pulse had picked up in a way she resented. "You're engaged, Mr. Boone. I know it. Then I'd think careful about what you mean and don't mean when you're saying it to me." He nodded, once accepted the truth of that without argument, and paid for his coffee in exact change, same as always. But as he walked out, he glanced back just once, just for a moment, and Odessa found she had been watching the door long enough to catch it. She told herself it changed nothing. She had built her life in Miles City on the certainty that a man's attention, however gently offered, was a debt she could not afford to owe. But that night, closing out the store's ledger by lamplight, she found she had written his name twice in the margin without meaning to, and had to cross it out both times before Mrs. Higgins could see. The office of Pratt Cattleman's Bank smelled of leather and cigar smoke, and Edgar Pratt kept Silas standing a full minute before gesturing him into the chair across the desk, a small cruelty he seemed to enjoy. "Your father's note comes due before the first snow," Edgar said, sliding the paper across the desk without preamble. "Full sum, $2,400 plus what's accrued since spring." Silas didn't touch the paper. He already knew the number better than he knew his own hands. "I've got the fall herd to sell yet. Cattle prices are down 11% from last year. You know that as well as I do." Edgar folded his hands. "There's another way through this, Boone. One I've already put some thought toward. Constance, my daughter needs a husband who can hold land, and you need a debt forgiven. It solves two problems at once. I'll tear this note in half the day you two are married, and the Boone Ranch stays in Boone hands. Otherwise, I foreclose in the spring, same as I would with any man who owed me money." Silas had turned this offer over in his mind for 3 weeks already, ever since his mother had first raised it at the supper table, her voice carefully hopeful in the way it got when she was trying not to sound as desperate as she felt. He thought of his father, 2 years dead now, who had built the ranch up from 40 head to 400, and had died believing his son would keep it whole. He thought of the promise he'd made at the man's bedside, his father's hand thin and dry in his own. "Don't let it go, Silas. Whatever it costs you, don't let it go." "I'll do it," Silas said. The words came out steadier than he felt saying them. Edgar smiled. The transaction settled the way he settled every transaction, without warmth, without waste. "Good man. We'll announce it at the fall social." Gives Constance time to ready herself. Silas signed where indicated. His signature came out smaller and more cramped than usual, as though some part of his hand were trying to withhold what the rest of him had already agreed to. He rode out of town afterward, without stopping at Higgins Dry Goods, though his supply list had 2 items left unbought. He told himself the ride home was simply faster that way. But he found himself slowing his horse as he passed the store's front window, and he caught one glimpse of Odessa inside, sleeves rolled to the elbow, arranging tins on a shelf with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. He did not go in. He sat his horse at the hitching post across the street for the length of one held breath and then rode on. That evening, his mother, Margaret Boone, found him on the porch long after supper, staring out at land he had just signed half his future away to keep. "You did right," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "Your father would be proud." Would he? It wasn't a question so much as a thing he needed to see aloud and hear answered back to him. Of course he would. You saved the ranch. Silas didn't answer that. He was thinking instead of his father's ledger, not the ranch accounts, which he knew by heart, but the older private notebook the old man had kept in a drawer of his desk, filled with notes that had nothing to do with cattle prices. He hadn't opened it since the funeral. He wasn't sure why he was thinking of it now. except that some part of him wanted to know if his father, faced with the same choice, would have signed his name the way Silas just had. "Constance is a fine girl," Margaret said, when the silence had stretched long enough to worry her. "She is. You don't sound glad of it." Silas turned to look at his mother, and for a moment the careful stillness he wore for the rest of the world slipped just slightly in front of her. "I signed the note, Ma. That's all that needs saying." She studied him a moment longer, the way mothers do when they suspect there's more beneath a son's words than he's willing to give voice to, and then let it go because some things in the Boone family were simply not spoken aloud until they had to be. Silas sat on the porch long after she'd gone in, the fall air sharp enough now to bite through his shirt, and found his thoughts returning against every instruction he gave them to a woman, counting exact change into his palm and asking him plainly what he meant by the things he said. He did not have an answer for her. He was no longer certain he had one for himself. Odessa was totaling a bulk order flour, salt, pork, dried beans, enough to see a ranch through to spring, when Silas reached into his coat before she'd finished counting. "I'll pay it all now," he said. "Save you the trouble of carrying a balance." Her hands stilled on the ledger. It was an ordinary offer, the kind any customer might make. But money offered up front, generous and unasked for, was exactly the shape kindness had taken in Missouri before it curdled into something else. She kept a tin box beneath a loose floorboard in her room above the Larkspur boarding house. A dozen water-stained receipts, each bearing the signature of a Missouri landowner named Emery Sutter, who had promised her father 3 seasons of fair wages and paid not one of them. Sutter always had a reason: a poor cotton year, a debt of his own. Next season would make it right. Her father believed him until the believing cost him everything he had. She had lost more than wages to that kind of trust. She had lost a man named August, too, dragged from a rail platform over a debt that was never his, and no promise from anyone had been enough to save him. She did not tell Silas any of that. She only felt her shoulders go rigid, her pen stop mid-stroke, and he saw it plainly enough without needing the whole story explained. "Never mind," he said, withdrawing his hand. "Standard terms are fine. Pay it out as the goods come. Why'd you offer if you'll withdraw it that easy? Didn't want to argue you into something that put that look on your face." He said it plainly, no wounded pride in it. Whatever put it there wasn't my business to pry at. Figured backing off was faster than asking. Odessa studied him a moment, surprised at how little defense he'd required. Most men want an explanation once they've been refused. Most men aren't half as interested in an explanation as they are in being told they're owed one. He shrugged, hefting a sack onto his shoulder. "I'd rather earn the explanation than demand it." She finished the tally with steadier hands than she'd started it. When Mrs. Higgins came in from the back room to find Silas gone, and Odessa still standing at the counter, ledger closed, she didn't ask what had passed between them. She only noted with the particular attentiveness of a woman who missed very little that Odessa's hand had come to rest on the tin box's hiding place beneath the floor without her seeming to know she'd done it. That night alone, Odessa took the box out anyway, turning Sutter's old receipts over one more time. She had built her whole life in Miles City on the certainty that a man's kindness was a debt she couldn't afford to owe. But she found herself thinking not of Sutter's broken promises, nor of August's death, but of the plain, unbothered way Silas had said, "I'd rather earn the explanation than demand it," as though patience itself might be worth something if a person meant it. She still didn't trust it. She put the receipts away and told herself that was the end of the matter. It wasn't. 2 days later, when he came in again, this time simply to return a crate Mrs. Higgins had lent his mother weeks before, Odessa found herself asking, before she'd decided to, "You always return borrowed things this promptly, Mr. Boone. Try to. Man who doesn't return what he borrows generally forgets who he owes." He set the crate down. "Learned that from my father, same as most things I know." "Sounds like a good man, your father," Something shifted in his face, not quite pain, but something adjacent to it. Sounds like it. Didn't always feel it living with him. He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask him to. But she noted filing it away, the way she filed away everything worth remembering, that he'd let something private slip in front of her, without seeming to regret it, the first crack, however small, in a man she'd assumed kept everything locked as tightly as she did. Constance Pratt stood on a stool, while the dressmaker pinned the hem of her ivory gown, answering "Fine, Papa" to every question about her happiness without once looking at her own reflection. The letter in her writing desk's bottom drawer was from a surveyor in Bozeman named Thomas Reyes, 2 years of quiet correspondence. Nothing improper in a single line of it, only two people who understood, without saying so, that they wanted lives neither of their fathers had planned for them. She hadn't answered his last letter. She wasn't sure what was left to say with the wedding 9 days off, and the dress already fitted to her waist. That afternoon, riding into town for ribbon, Constance stopped first at Higgins Dry Goods for thread, and found Odessa Grant behind the counter, tallying an order with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "You're the one who does the baking here," Constance said, more observation than question. "I am. Silas mentions your bread. More than once, actually." Constance said it plainly, watching for a reaction, and finding none, Odessa's face gave away nothing, though her hands paused a half-second on the ledger. "I don't say that to embarrass you. I say it because I think you should know exactly how often a man says a woman's name when he doesn't think anyone's counting." Odessa met her eyes evenly. "I don't know what you'd have me do with that, Miss Pratt. Neither do I, if I'm honest." Constance picked up her thread and set her coins on the counter unhurried. "I only know I've spent this whole engagement watching a man perform devotion he doesn't feel, and I'd rather not watch you spend yours pretending you haven't noticed the one thing he does feel." She left before Odessa could answer out into the cold, and rode home turning her own words over, surprised at herself for having said them at all. That evening at supper, Edgar Pratt raised his glass to the coming announcement, and Constance smiled where a smile was required. 9 days, he said, satisfied, as though the number itself were a kind of victory. "Your grandfather would have liked that." "Would he have liked Silas?" "He'd have liked the land. That's generally enough." Constance excused herself early and sat a long while with Thomas Reyes's letter open in front of her, not writing anything, only reading his plain, ordinary sentences about the mountains along the Yellowstone survey line, described the way other men described women. She thought of Silas forgetting himself over a bakery counter. She thought of the particular unfairness of an arrangement that asked two people to build a life on land and debt and family names, and called it a marriage without ever asking either of them what they wanted. She did not yet know what she meant to do about any of it. But she left the letter out on the desk that night, where she'd have to look at it again come morning, and decide instead of folding it away beneath the stationery, the way she always had before. Downstairs, her father's voice carried up through the floorboards, discussing wedding logistics with her mother, as though the outcome had never been in question. Constance sat listening to it, and felt for the first time since the arrangement was made, a small and stubborn spark of her own will beginning to catch one that looked nothing like the ivory dress waiting in her closet, and nothing at all like the marriage her father had already toasted as settled. The flue above the bakery oven had been smoking for 3 days before Mrs. Higgins admitted the problem was beyond her own hands. "I can look at it," Silas said from the doorway, come to collect an order and finding an excuse to stay longer than the transaction required. "Spent 10 winters keeping a ranch house from freezing solid. Learn a thing or two about draft." He worked the afternoon on the roof, clearing a bird's nest wedged deep in the chimney, and Odessa brought him coffee at midday, finding him more at ease up there, soot-streaked, than she'd ever seen him at the counter below. "A man engaged to be married in a week generally has better things to do than clean another woman's chimney," she said. "Maybe I don't want the week to come." He said it quiet half to himself, and neither of them chased the sentence any further. While he worked, Margaret Boone came into the store for needles and found Odessa alone at the counter, her son's boots audible on the roof overhead. "He's been up there 3 hours," Margaret said, settling near the stove without much ceremony. "Longer than any chimney needs, I'd wager. Draft was bad. Nest all the way down." Margaret's eyes were sharp, the same steady gray as her son's. "You know his father built this ranch from 40 head to 400 and near lost all of it once, the same way Silas is near losing it now. Debt to a Bozeman bank back before Constance Pratt's family had any claim on us. Silas's father sold off half his herd at a loss to cover it, rather than take a shortcut he thought would cost him something he couldn't get back." She measured out her thread unhurried. "He wasn't a man who talked much of what things cost him, but he paid the honest way every time I ever saw him choose, even when the dishonest way would have been easier, and nobody the wiser. Why tell me this? Because my son's the same whether he knows it yet or not, and I'd hate for anyone judging him to mistake his quiet for indifference." Margaret paid for her needles and gathered her basket. "I don't know what's between you and Silas, and I won't pretend I haven't wondered. But I'd rather you know the kind of man his father was from someone who watched him be it than guess at it from rumor." She left before Odessa could answer, and Odessa stood a long moment at the counter, turning the words over. She had built her caution in Missouri on watching men break their word the moment keeping it cost them something. She had never once considered that a man might exist who paid the cost anyway quietly, without ever asking credit for it. Silas climbed down near dusk soot on his collar and found Odessa waiting with a rag and a basin she'd set out without being asked. "Chimney'll hold through winter," he said. "Draft's clean. Your mother came by." Something flickered across his face, a brief wariness. "What did she say? That your father sold half his herd once rather than take a shortcut?" Odessa held the rag out. "Said you were the same whether you knew it or not." Silas took the rag slowly, his hand brushing hers, and neither pulled back this time quite as fast as before. "Don't know if that's true. I'm starting to wonder if it might be." He didn't answer that. He only nodded once, thanked her plainly, and rode home in the fading light, with something in his chest that hadn't been there that morning, the small, unfamiliar weight of being seen clearly by someone who'd spent 2 years refusing to look at any man too closely. Odessa closed the ledger that night, having written nothing in the margins she needed to cross out. For the first time since Missouri, she found she no longer wanted to. The fall gathering at Miles City Union Chapel was meant to raise funds for the new schoolhouse roof, and every family within a day's ride had turned out for it, tables of cornbread and cider set along the churchyard fence. Odessa came because Mrs. Higgins asked her to help serve, and because she had learned over 2 years in Miles City that staying away from town gatherings only invited more talk than showing up ever did. She wore her good gray dress and kept her hands busy at the cider table, and told herself she expected nothing more from the afternoon than sore feet and small talk. She noticed the first slight within the hour, a cluster of ranch wives who moved their conversation a few feet down the table the moment she stepped near, not rudely, not with any word spoken aloud, simply a small and practiced rearrangement, the kind of exclusion that left no handle for a person to grab and call unfair. She had endured worse in Missouri. She endured this the same way, with her spine straight and her hands steady on the cider ladle filling cups for anyone who held one out, whether they'd shifted away from her a moment before or not. Silas arrived with his mother in the early afternoon, already promised to Constance Pratt in name, if not yet in ceremony, and found himself within minutes of arriving, drawn toward the cider table the way a compass needle finds north, whether or not the man holding it wants to go that direction. "Cider's good this year," he said, coming to stand at the table's edge. "Mrs. Higgins's recipe. I only pour it." Odessa filled his cup without meeting his eyes, aware of how many people in the churchyard had already noticed him standing there. He didn't leave after she'd filled it. He stood a moment longer, cup in hand, And Odessa felt the particular weight of being watched not only by him, but by the ranch wives further down the table, whose conversation had gone noticeably quieter. Mr. Boone, one of them called finally a woman named Ida Fletcher, wife of a cattleman with land bordering Boone Ranch. Shouldn't you be finding your intended wouldn't do for word to travel that you spent the church social at the cider table? The words were light, almost teasing, but the intent beneath them was plain enough for anyone listening to understand exactly what was being implied, and exactly who was being warned off by it. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice either or make any show of the moment. He simply turned toward Ida Fletcher, with the same even unhurried manner he brought to everything, and said, "I'll find her when I've a mind to. Right now I'm getting a cup of good cider from a woman who knows how to pour one properly. Nothing improper in that, unless somebody's decided to make it so." The churchyard didn't go silent exactly. Conversations continued, plates were passed. Children ran between the tables the way children always do. But something in the air shifted a small recalibration of what was and wasn't permissible to say aloud in Silas Boone's hearing. Ida Fletcher's mouth tightened, but she said nothing further. She turned back to her own conversation, and the moment passed the way most small cruelties in Miles City passed, not resolved, not undone, but interrupted at least for the length of an afternoon. Odessa kept pouring cider. Her hands steady, though her chest had gone tight during the exchange in a way she was careful not to show. She had not asked him to speak for her. She had not needed him to. She had weathered Ida Fletcher's kind of comment 100 times over without anyone standing beside her to interrupt it. But there was something in the plain, unbothered way he had done it, without drama, without making himself the hero of the moment, that settled differently in her than any defense she'd received before. "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly, once the cider table had a lull. "I know I didn't." He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "Did it anyway. Your fiancé's family owns half the paper on half this territory. That kind of talk could cost you more than an afternoon's comfort. Maybe." He looked at her, then steady, unhurried. "Some costs are worth paying." She didn't answer that. She only refilled his cup, though he hadn't asked for more, and let the gesture stand in place of words neither of them was yet ready to say plainly. By the time the social ended and families loaded into wagons for the ride home, word had already begun to travel through Miles City of what Silas Boone had said at the cider table and to whom. Some found it scandalous. Some quietly found it the first thing about the coming Boone-Pratt marriage that had sounded like an actual man speaking, rather than a business arrangement wearing a man's coat. Odessa rode home in the Higgins wagon that evening, turning the afternoon over in her mind, and found that for the first time since Missouri, she had let a man's defense of her stand without immediately building a wall against it. She did not know yet what to do with that, but she no longer felt entirely certain she wanted to tear the wall back up. Edgar Pratt heard about the cider table before the week was out, the way Edgar Pratt heard about everything that touched his interests sooner or later. He summoned Silas to the bank on a gray Tuesday morning, and this time did not bother with the courtesy of making him wait. "I hear you made a scene at the church social," Edgar said, without looking up from the papers on his desk. "Defending the Grant woman at Higgins's store. Wasn't a scene. Woman got spoken to unkindly. I said something about it. That's all it was. That's not all Ida Fletcher tells it, and it's certainly not all half this territory is now saying." Edgar finally raised his eyes, and there was nothing businesslike left in them, only a cold, personal anger that made the room feel smaller than it was. "You're set to marry my daughter in 8 days, Boone. I won't have talk that my son-in-law's affections are elsewhere before the ink's even dry on the marriage license. There's no talk worth having. Nothing's happened that shouldn't have." "Then you'll prove it," Edgar said. "You'll stop going into that store. You'll stop buying from Higgins altogether. Send your mother, send a ranch hand. I don't care who, but you'll not set foot in there again before the wedding. and not after it either, if you've any sense. Or the note comes due in full this week, and I'll have the sheriff walk your cattle off Boone land myself." Silas sat with that a long moment, the weight of it settling into his chest, the way cold settles into a house with a bad chimney slow, and then all at once. He thought of his father's hand in his own, at the deathbed, the promise he'd made. He thought of Odessa's steady hands counting change of the smoke rising clean from a chimney he'd fixed for no payment, but a cup of coffee and a moment of her attention. "That's the whole sum," he said finally, "before the first snow. That's the arrangement, same as it's always been. I'm only asking you to honor the parts of it you seem to have forgotten." Silas rode home that afternoon, with the ultimatum sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone. He did not go by the store. He told himself it was only prudence, only the sensible course for a man 8 days from marriage, and knew, even as he told himself so, that it felt nothing like prudence, and everything like a door being shut on something he had not yet been ready to close. His mother found him that evening, standing at the fence line looking out over land that had been Boone land for 2 generations, and said nothing for a long while, only stood beside him, the way she used to when he was a boy, working through some trouble too big for a child's shoulders. "You haven't been yourself," Margaret said finally. "Not since you signed that note. I gave my word, Ma, to Pa and now to Pratt both. Your father's word was always his own to give. I wonder sometimes if he ever stopped to ask whether the giving of it cost him more than the land was worth." She turned to look at him directly. "I loved your father a great deal, Silas. But there were things he let go of for the sake of this ranch that I don't think he ever entirely forgave himself for losing. I'd hate to see you walk that same road without at least knowing you'd chosen it eyes open." Silas didn't answer her. He didn't yet have words for the thing rising in him. Not quite regret, not quite resolve, but some restless combination of both that kept him awake long after the house had gone dark, staring at the ceiling of a room that had been his since boyhood, turning his father's old promise over and over, like a coin he could no longer tell the true weight of. He did not go into town for 4 days. Each day the absence sat heavier in him than the day before, a debt of its own kind, one Edgar Pratt's ledger had no entry for and never would. On the 5th day, Silas rode out to the small family plot on a rise above the ranch house where his father was buried beneath a plain granite stone, and sat a long while in the cold without speaking. He had not come with any particular purpose. He had simply found himself unable to sit still in the ranch house any longer, and the grave was where his feet carried him when nothing else in the world seemed steady enough to hold his weight. "I kept my word," he said finally, to the stone, to the cold air, to no one who could answer him back. "Ranch is safe. Notes near paid. You'd be satisfied, I expect." The wind answered him the way it always did, with nothing but its own indifferent motion through the dry grass. He rode back to the house afterward, and for the first time since the funeral, opened the bottom drawer of his father's old desk, where a worn leather notebook had sat untouched for 2 years. He had always assumed it held nothing but ranch business feed costs, breeding records, the ordinary accounting of a working cattle operation. He had never had reason to open it before now. Most of it was exactly what he'd expected. But near the back, in a hand grown shakier with age, he found an entry that had nothing to do with cattle at all. "There was a woman in Ohio before I ever came west," his father had written. "Her name was Mary Coates, and I loved her the way a young man loves before he's learned to be careful about it. My own father needed the farm sold to a man who'd only buy it if I married his niece instead, and I did it because I told myself land was the only inheritance worth protecting. I have built a good life since. I do not regret my wife, nor my son, nor the years we've had. But I have wondered on nights like this one what I traded away in Ohio, and whether the land was ever worth what it cost me to keep it. If Silas ever stands where I once stood, I hope he chooses better than I had the courage to. Silas read the entry 3 times before he set the notebook down, his hands unsteady in a way 10 winters of ranch work had never once made them. He understood reading it that his father's dying words don't let it go. Whatever it costs, you had not been a simple instruction to hold the land at any price. They had been the words of a man still working through his own old regret, still uncertain, even at the end, whether the choice he'd made in Ohio had been the right one, and hoping in the only way he knew how that his son might find a clearer answer than he had. Silas sat with the notebook a long while in the dimming light, the weight of it settling into him slowly, the way understanding sometimes does not as a single revelation, but as a series of small recognitions, arriving one after another, until the shape of the whole thing became clear. He thought of Odessa's steady hands, her ledger, her tin box of unpaid debts, kept beneath a floorboard, as a reminder of exactly what a promise was worth, when the person making it decided the cost was too high. He thought of his father's careful, permanent regret carried silently for 30 years, and confessed only to a private notebook no one was ever meant to read. He did not want that for himself. He did not want to be an old man someday, writing some quiet confession in a ledger his own son would find after he was gone, wondering what he had traded away, out of fear of what it might cost him to choose otherwise. He closed the notebook and sat with it in his lap until the light outside had gone fully dark, and when he finally rose, something in his bearing had changed. Not resolved, not yet, but no longer entirely uncertain either. He did not know yet exactly what he meant to do. But he knew, for the first time since signing Edgar Pratt's note, precisely what he did not want his life to become. Constance Pratt came to the Boone Ranch 2 days before her own wedding was set to take place, riding alone, without her mother's knowledge, in a plain wool coat that made her look younger than her father's ledgers ever allowed her to feel. Silas met her at the gate, surprised enough that he forgot for a moment the careful composure he generally kept in front of the Pratt family. "Constance, something wrong." "Nothing's wrong. I've come to talk plainly, if you'll let me." She dismounted without waiting for his help, an unassuming practical motion that told him more about her state of mind than any words yet had. "May we sit somewhere? This won't take long, but I'd rather not say it standing in a doorway." They sat on the porch, the same porch where Silas had spent so many recent evenings turning his father's regret over in his mind, and Constance drew a folded letter from her coat pocket, though she did not yet hand it over. "There's a man in Bozeman," she said, "a surveyor, Thomas Reyes. We've written to each other 2 years now, and I've never once told my father because I knew exactly what he'd say about a man with no land and no name worth merging into a Pratt ledger." She turned the letter over in her hands. "I'm not telling you this to make my own case for sympathy, Silas. I'm telling you because I think you and I have both spent this engagement performing something neither of us actually wants, and I don't believe either of us owes it to my father to keep performing it any longer." Silas sat with that a long moment. "Your father will call the note the moment word gets out this marriage isn't happening. I expect he will." Constance's voice held no apology for it. "But that's your debt to carry, and mine to carry is my own life, which I don't intend to spend married to a man who counts change more carefully at a bakery counter than he's ever once looked at me." She said it without cruelty, only plain observation, the kind 2 people can sometimes offer each other once all pretense has worn away. "I saw you at Higgins's store, Silas. I saw the church social too, same as everyone else in this territory did. I don't think either of us is doing the other any kindness pretending we haven't." Silas nodded slowly, some tight, unnamed thing in his chest, beginning finally to loosen. "I'm sorry it's cost you anything standing up to your father over this. Don't be sorry. I've wanted to stand up to him over a great many things for a great many years. This is simply the first time I've had a reason worth the trouble." She finally held the ring out to him, a small plain gold band that had sat on her finger for 3 weeks, without ever once feeling like it belonged there. I release you from the arrangement, Silas Boone. Whatever comes of the note that's between you and my father now, and no longer any business of mine. Silas took the ring, turning it once in his fingers before pocketing it. Thank you, Constance. Truly. Don't thank me. Just don't waste whatever you've found once you've found the courage to say so out loud. I intend to go find mine in Bozeman, and I'd rather not think I did it only to watch you sit on yours out of habit. She remounted without ceremony and rode back toward town, back toward the reckoning she knew was waiting for her at her father's house, carrying herself with a straightness of spine Silas had never once seen in her during the whole length of their engagement. He stood at the gate a long while after she'd gone, the small weight of the ring in his coat pocket, the larger weight of what came next settling over him, with a clarity that felt for the first time in weeks entirely his own to carry. He knew Edgar Pratt would call the note before the week was out. He knew too exactly what he meant to do about it, and exactly whose door he meant to walk through first. The Yellowstone Valley fall auction drew half the territory into Miles City's stockyards on a cold, clear morning. Ranchers and buyers filling the pens and walkways to bid on the season's cattle, and Edgar Pratt stood near the auction block with the satisfaction of a man who had by his own accounting already won. He had called the note 2 days after Constance rode home from the Boone Ranch, with an empty ring finger and a letter to Bozeman finally sent. Silas had not argued the calling of it. He had simply asked for one thing, that the final settlement, whatever it came to be conducted publicly at the fall auction in front of the buyers and ranchers who made up the whole of his livelihood and his name. Edgar had agreed, assuming the public setting would only humiliate the younger man further. He had not expected Silas to climb onto the auction platform itself in front of the full gathered crowd, before the first lot of cattle had even been called. "Folks know my father built this ranch from 40 head to 400, Silas said, his voice carrying clean across the stockyard in the cold air. Folks know, too, I signed a note this fall to keep it whole and agreed to a marriage that would have paid that note off in full. That marriage isn't happening. Miss Pratt's released from it same as I am, and there's no blame owed to her for it. The fault, if there's fault to find, is mine alone for ever agreeing to trade a life for a debt in the first place." A murmur went through the crowd. Edgar Pratt's face had gone the color of old ash. "I found something of my father's this past week," Silas went on. "A private word he left behind about a choice he made young, trading a woman he loved for a piece of land he thought he couldn't live without. He carried that trade the rest of his life, and never once in 30 years told a living soul it cost him anything at all. I don't intend to make the same trade nor carry the same silence." He looked out at the crowd until he found the one face he'd come to say this in front of Odessa, standing near the stockyard fence with Mrs. Higgins, her expression carefully unreadable, though her hands had gone still on the rail. "I love a woman in this town who's given me no promise back and asked for none because she's learned the hard way what a man's word is worth when it comes time to collect. I don't blame her for that caution. I mean to spend however long it takes proving it wrong." The stockyard had gone entirely quiet now, buyers and ranchers alike watching a scene none of them had expected from a man known mostly for his silence. Edgar Pratt found his voice first sharp with fury. "You'll lose the ranch, Boone. Every acre of it the day this auction ends." "Maybe I will," Silas said. "I've spent 10 years believing the land was the only inheritance worth keeping whole. I've come to think my father wondered the same thing his whole life and never got the chance to answer it different. I'd rather answer it now in front of everybody than carry the same silent regret to my own grave." He climbed down from the platform, and the crowd parted around him, the way crowds do when they've just witnessed something they don't yet have words to describe, and he walked the length of the stockyard until he stood in front of Odessa, close enough now that the whole town could see exactly what he meant by everything he'd just said. "I don't have the land settled, he said quietly, just for her. Might not have it settled by tonight, but I wanted you to hear it plain in front of people who'll remember it, so you'd never have cause to wonder if I meant it. Odessa looked at him a long moment, the tin box of unpaid Missouri debts sitting in memory, beneath everything she'd built her caution on these past 2 years. But she looked too at the stockyard full of witnesses, at Edgar Pratt's fury, at the particular cost Silas Boone had just chosen to pay in the plainest possible daylight, and understood that a man protecting himself from consequence does not generally choose to make his confession in front of an entire county. She stepped forward, the first step either of them had taken toward the other in the whole length of this story, and took his hand in front of everyone. "Then I heard you," she said, plainly. Behind them, Edgar Pratt's threats dissolved into the ordinary business of an auction, resuming around a scandal it would talk about for years, and somewhere in the crowd, Constance Pratt, who had ridden in from Bozeman only that morning for reasons of her own, watched the whole scene with something like relief on her face. Glad to see at least one of them had found the courage she'd only just discovered in herself. The ranch, in the end, was saved by neither the marriage nor the note, but by a decision Silas made that winter to sell off the northern grazing acreage to a neighboring outfit land his father had never truly needed, only held onto out of the same fear that had cost the old man his own Ohio regret. It was enough to satisfy what remained of the debt, and it left the house, the home pasture, and the family plot on the rise all safely. Boone land still whole in the ways that had always mattered most. Outro. This was never really a story about land or debt or a note coming due before the first snow. It was about two people who'd each learned in their own hard way to be careful with their trust, and who found finally that the only way to build something lasting was to risk it plainly in daylight, in front of everyone who might judge them for it. If you've ever had to choose between the safe thing and the true thing, tell me in the comments what you chose and whether you'd choose it again. If this story kept you company today, I'd be grateful if you'd like it and subscribe. There's another story coming soon, and I'd love to have you back for it.
This was never really a story about land or debt or a note coming due before the first snow. It was about two people who each learned in their own hard way to be careful with their trust and who found finally that the only way to build something lasting was to risk it painfully in daily in front of everyone who might judge them for it. If you've ever had to choose between the safe thing and the true thing, tell me in the comments what you would choose and whether you would choose it again. If this story kept you company today, I would be grateful if you like it and subscribe. There's another story coming soon, and I would love to have you back for it.